The rope was already measured when the women came to prepare her body, not for burial, for display. Sarah Whitfield sat on the floor of the root cellar beneath the church, hands bound with jute cord that had cut deep enough to draw blood, and listened to the voices above deciding how tightly the noose should be knotted to ensure she would strangle slowly. She was 23 years old, 6 months pregnant, and the entire town of Crow's Mill had voted by show of hands in the churchyard that she should die before sunrise. They didn't accuse her of murder. They accused her of something worse, of choosing, of wanting, of loving a man they had decided she had no right to love. And in the mountains of eastern Kentucky in the winter of 1887, that was enough to justify what they were about to do. Welcome to this channel. Today, we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. Like the video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The first thing you need to understand about Crow's Mill is that it was never meant to be found. Nestled in a hollow so deep that winter darkness came at 3 in the afternoon, the town existed in a state of geographical and cultural isolation that made it almost invisible to the outside world. The nearest rail line was 40 miles south through terrain so hostile that even experienced travelers avoided it. The postal road stopped 10 miles short of the town limits, ending abruptly at a creek crossing that washed out every spring and was never repaired. By the time Sarah Whitfield was born in 1864, Crow's Mill had been losing contact with the broader world for 2 generations. What remained was a community of fewer than 300 people, most of them related by blood or marriage, living in a pocket of Appalachia that seemed to exist outside of time. They had their own ways, their own rules, and their own ideas about justice that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with collective survival. In a place like that, reputation wasn't just important, it was existential. And once the community decided you had violated its unspoken codes, there was nowhere to run and no one to appeal to. You belonged to them, and they could do whatever they wanted. Sarah's family had deep roots in Crow's Mill, going back to before the town had a name. Her great-grandfather had been among the first settlers, arriving sometime in the 1790s, fleeing debts or crimes or simply the press of civilization. He had built a cabin on the eastern ridge, cleared land for tobacco, and raised a family that grew into a clan. By the time Sarah was born, the Whitfield name was everywhere in Crow's Mill. Her father, Marcus Whitfield, was a blacksmith and a lay preacher, a man whose authority came not from education but from the sheer force of his presence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and known for a temper that could turn violent without warning. He beat his children when they disobeyed. He beat his wife when she questioned him. And he beat his animals when they didn't work fast enough. But he was also respected, because in Crow's Mill, strength was a virtue and mercy was a weakness. Sarah's mother, Eliza, was a quiet woman who had learned early in her marriage that survival meant silence. She bore 6 children, buried 2, and spent her days cooking, cleaning, mending, and praying. Sarah was her eldest surviving daughter, and by all accounts they were close, though that closeness would be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. Sarah grew up in a world where women's lives were tightly circumscribed. She attended the one-room schoolhouse until she was 12, then stayed home to help her mother with the endless labor of running a household without modern conveniences. She learned to spin, weave, sew, cook, preserve, and tend the kitchen garden that provided most of the family's vegetables. She attended church every Sunday and every Wednesday evening, sitting in the back pew with the other unmarried women, listening to sermons that emphasized obedience, submission, and the dangers of sin. She was, by all accounts, exactly what a young woman in Crow's Mill was supposed to be: dutiful, quiet, invisible. But something happened in the spring of 1886 that would change everything. A stranger came to town. His name was Daniel Mercer. And from the moment he arrived, people knew he didn't belong. Daniel Mercer was not from the mountains. That was clear from the way he dressed, the way he spoke, the way he moved through the world with a confidence that seemed almost foreign. He claimed to be a timber surveyor, hired by a lumber company out of Cincinnati to assess the old-growth forests on the slopes above Crow's Mill. He rented a room in the boarding house run by a widow named Prudence Cole and spent his days hiking into the woods with surveying equipment, marking trees, making notes. He was educated, which immediately set him apart. He could read and write not just English but Latin. He carried books. He spoke about places most people in Crow's Mill had never heard of, and he was polite to everyone, which in a place where politeness was often a mask for weakness, made people suspicious. But what really made people uneasy was the way he looked at Sarah Whitfield, and the way she looked back. The first documented mention of Sarah and Daniel appears in a letter written in June of 1886 by a woman named Martha Pickett to her cousin in Lexington. The letter was discovered in an estate sale in 1968 and is now part of the Kentucky Historical Society's collection of Appalachian correspondence. Martha wrote, "There is a surveyor here from the north, a man called Mercer, who has taken an unseemly interest in Marcus Whitfield's eldest girl. I have seen them speaking together on 3 separate occasions, once near the creek and twice outside the church after service. Sarah does not lower her eyes when he approaches, which troubles me. Her father does not seem to notice, or perhaps he does not care, but others have begun to talk. You know how quickly rumor spreads in a place this small. I fear something unfortunate will come of it." What exactly transpired between Sarah Whitfield and Daniel Mercer is impossible to know with certainty. No letters between them survive. No diary entries confirm an affair. What we have are the testimonies of people who claim to have seen them together, always filtered through layers of suspicion, moral judgment, and the passage of time. Eliza Hutchins, a neighbor, later told a researcher that she saw Sarah and Daniel walking together in the woods in early July, talking in low voices, standing closer than propriety allowed. Thomas Early, who ran the general store, claimed that Daniel came in one afternoon and asked if he sold fabric suitable for a woman's dress, an inquiry that seemed strange enough to be remembered decades later. And Prudence Cole, the boarding house keeper, told multiple people that she heard Daniel packing his room late at night, and once found a piece of paper on which he had written Sarah's name over and over again, though she later admitted she couldn't read and might have been mistaken. The truth is, we don't know if Sarah and Daniel were romantically involved. We don't know if they were lovers, or if they simply talked, finding in each other something that was missing in their own lives. But in Crow's Mill, the distinction didn't matter. What mattered was perception, and by summer's end, the perception was fixed. Sarah Whitfield and Daniel Mercer were involved in something improper, something shameful, something that threatened the moral order of the entire community. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In late August of 1886, Daniel Mercer left Crow's Mill. The circumstances of his departure are disputed. Some say his contract with the lumber company ended, and he simply moved on to the next job. Others claim he was warned by several men in town that his continued presence was unwelcome, and that if he didn't leave voluntarily, he would be removed by force. A third version, whispered but never officially recorded, suggests that Daniel didn't leave at all, that he was taken into the woods one night and never seen again, his body buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the vast forest that surrounded the town. There is no way to verify any of these accounts. What is certain is that after late August, there is no further trace of Daniel Mercer, no employment records, no census listings, no death certificate. He vanished as completely as if he had never existed, and the story should have ended there. But 3 months later, in November of 1886, people began to notice that Sarah Whitfield was changing. Her dresses fit differently. Her face had a fullness it hadn't had before, and she stopped attending church, claiming illness, though she was sometimes seen walking alone near the creek, her hand resting on her stomach in a gesture that women recognized immediately. The pregnancy was confirmed by December. Sarah's mother, Eliza, confided in a neighbor, perhaps hoping to find sympathy or support, but the confidence was not kept. Within days, everyone in Crow's Mill knew that Sarah Whitfield was with child, and the questions that followed were sharp and unforgiving. Who was the father? Was it Daniel Mercer? Had Sarah been intimate with the surveyor? Had she willingly given herself to an outsider, or had something more sinister occurred? The questions quickly became accusations. The accusations became certainties. And by Christmas, the narrative was set. Sarah Whitfield had engaged in fornication with a stranger, had become pregnant out of wedlock, and had brought shame not just on herself and her family but on the entire community. The fact that Daniel Mercer was gone, that he could not be questioned or held accountable, only intensified the anger. The town had been violated by an outsider, and the evidence of that violation was growing inside Sarah Whitfield's body. Something had to be done, and the person who would decide what that something was Sarah's own father. Marcus Whitfield's reaction to his daughter's pregnancy was, by all accounts, one of cold fury. He did not shout. He did not weep. He simply stopped speaking to Sarah, treating her as if she no longer existed. She was moved from the room she shared with her sisters to a small space in the attic, barely large enough for a cot and a chamber pot. She was not allowed to eat with the family. She was not allowed to leave the house. And she was not allowed to speak unless spoken to, which almost never happened. Marcus made no attempt to find Daniel Mercer or to seek any kind of justice for what had been done to his daughter. Instead, he focused his energy on damage control, on figuring out how to minimize the shame Sarah had brought on the Whitfield name. He consulted with other men in town, men whose daughters were of marriageable age, men who understood that one woman's moral failing could taint the reputation of every family in Crow's Mill. And together, they began to formulate a plan. A plan that would restore order, punish sin, and send a message to anyone else who might be tempted to step outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior. A plan that would require Sarah Whitfield to pay the ultimate price for her alleged transgression. On the evening of January 3, 1887, a meeting was held in the basement of the Crow's Mill Methodist Church. No official record of this meeting exists, but it is referenced in multiple oral histories collected by researchers in the 1920s and 30s. According to these accounts, approximately 30 men attended, representing most of the prominent families in town. Marcus Whitfield was there. So was Reverend Josiah Thorne, the minister who had led the congregation for nearly 20 years. Also present were Caleb Hutchins, who owned the largest farm in the area, Silas Carter, who operated the grain mill, and Amos Pickett, Martha Pickett's husband and a man known for his rigid moral views. The meeting lasted several hours. The men discussed what should be done about Sarah Whitfield. Some argued that she should be sent away, forced to have the baby in secret and give it up for adoption, then return to Crow's Mill and live out her life in disgrace. Others argued that sending her away would not be enough, that her sin was too great to be hidden, that it required a public reckoning. And a few, led by Reverend Thorne, argued that what Sarah had done was not just a sin but a crime, a violation of God's law that demanded the harshest possible punishment. By the end of the meeting, a consensus had been reached. Sarah Whitfield would be brought before the community, given a chance to confess and repent, and then judged according to the will of the people. And if the people decided she deserved death, then death is what she would receive. The vote took place on the morning of January 15, 1887, in the churchyard. It was a Saturday, cold and clear, the ground frozen hard enough to ring under boot heels. Nearly every adult in Crow's Mill attended. Sarah was brought from her father's house by two men, her hands bound, her head covered with a flour sack so she couldn't see the faces of those who had gathered to judge her. She was made to stand in the center of the yard while Reverend Thorne addressed the crowd. He spoke for over an hour, reading passages from the Old Testament, passages about adultery and fornication and the punishment of the wicked. He spoke about Sodom and Gomorrah, about the necessity of purging sin from the community, about the dangers of allowing corruption to take root. And then he turned to Sarah and asked her directly, in front of everyone, if she had lain with Daniel Mercer. Sarah, her voice muffled by the sack over her head, said yes. She said it once quietly and the crowd erupted. Some shouted condemnations, others wept. A few remained silent, their faces unreadable. And then Reverend Thorne asked the second question. Did she repent? Did she beg God's forgiveness? And Sarah, either unable or unwilling to perform the expected contrition, said nothing. The silence stretched on for a full minute. And then Reverend Thorne told the crowd that the time had come to vote. Those who believed Sarah should be executed for her sin should raise their hands. Those who believed she should be spared should remain still. The vote was not unanimous, but it was overwhelming. Out of approximately 200 adults present, roughly 160 raised their hands. 40 did not. The rest abstained, either out of fear or uncertainty. But the majority had spoken. Sarah Whitfield would be hanged. The sentence would be carried out the following morning, and everyone in Crow's Mill, including the children, would be required to attend and witness. Because the point of the execution was not just to punish Sarah, but to teach a lesson, to show what happened to those who violated the community's moral codes, to ensure that no one else would ever make the same mistake, and to bind the town together in a shared act of violence that would make them all complicit, all guilty, all locked into a conspiracy of silence that would last for generations. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Sarah spent her last night in the root cellar beneath the church. It was a small space, damp and cold, used for storing preserved foods and cider. There was no heat, no light except for the faint glow of a lantern hung from a nail in the door. She was given no food, only water. Her mother, Eliza, was not allowed to see her. No one was. Marcus Whitfield stood guard at the cellar door for part of the night, though he never went inside. According to a later account, someone heard Sarah singing at some point in the early hours, a hymn she had learned as a child, the words drifting up through the floorboards of the church. But by dawn, the singing had stopped, and when the men came to bring her out, she was silent. The gallows were constructed in the churchyard during the night. They were not elaborate, just a simple wooden frame with a crossbeam and a rope, built by Caleb Hutchins and his 2 adult sons. The wood came from an old barn that had been dismantled the previous year, timber that was already darkened with age and weathering. The rope was new, purchased from the general store specifically for this purpose. It was tested with a sack of grain to ensure it would hold the weight. Everything was prepared with a kind of grim efficiency, as if the men building the gallows were constructing a shed or a fence, just another task to be completed. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement of what they were doing. They simply worked in the cold darkness, their breath steaming, their hands steady, and when the sun rose, the gallows were ready. Sarah was brought out of the cellar at first light. The flour sack had been removed from her head, and for the first time since her arrest, the people of Crow's Mill could see her face. She looked exhausted, her skin pale, her eyes red from crying or lack of sleep or both. Her hair, which had been long and dark, had been cut short, hacked off roughly, a mark of humiliation. Her dress was the same one she had been wearing for days, stained and torn. Her feet were bare despite the frozen ground. And her hands, still bound, showed dark bruises where the cords had cut off circulation. She walked slowly, flanked by 2 men, across the yard to the gallows. The crowd, which had been murmuring, fell silent as she approached. Children clung to their mothers. Women clutched handkerchiefs. Men stood with their arms crossed, their faces hard. and Sarah climbed the steps to the platform without assistance, her bare feet leaving faint marks on the frost-covered wood. Reverend Thorne read a final prayer. He asked God to have mercy on Sarah's soul and to forgive the community for what they were about to do. He spoke about the necessity of justice, about the importance of maintaining moral order, about the price of sin. And then he stepped aside, and Marcus Whitfield, Sarah's father, stepped forward to place the noose around his daughter's neck. This detail, more than any other, has haunted historians and descendants of Crow's Mill for over a century. Why did Marcus do it? Was he forced? Did he volunteer? Was it meant as a final assertion of patriarchal authority, a demonstration that he controlled his daughter's life from birth to death? We don't know. What we do know is that Marcus Whitfield placed the noose around Sarah's neck, adjusted it carefully to ensure it would tighten properly, and then stepped back without meeting her eyes. Sarah did not struggle. She did not scream. She stood on the platform, her body swaying slightly, and looked out at the crowd. And then she spoke. What Sarah Whitfield said in her final moments is disputed. Multiple versions of her last words exist, each slightly different, filtered through memory and the desire to impose meaning on an incomprehensible act. One account, recorded by a woman named Hannah Bledsoe in a letter to her sister, claims that Sarah said, "I loved him, and I am not sorry." Another version, collected in an oral history interview in 1932, suggests that Sarah said, "You are killing two, not one. Remember that." A third account, the most disturbing, claims that Sarah said nothing at all, that she simply stared at her father until he turned away, unable to bear her gaze. What is certain is that after Sarah spoke, or after the silence became unbearable, the signal was given. The floor beneath her feet, a simple trapdoor held in place by a single bolt, was released. Sarah Whitfield dropped approximately 4 feet. The rope snapped taut, and she began to strangle. Death by hanging, when done improperly, is not instantaneous. The drop was not long enough to break Sarah's neck, which means she died by asphyxiation, a process that can take several minutes. During that time, her body convulsed, her legs kicked, her face turned dark. The crowd watched in silence. No one turned away. No one left. They stood there, 200 people, and watched a pregnant woman strangled to death in the churchyard. Some later claimed they were forced to watch, that they wanted to leave but were prevented by the men who had organized the execution. Others admitted that they watched by choice, that they believed Sarah deserved what was happening to her, that they felt no guilt or sympathy. And a very few, said that watching Sarah die changed something inside them, that they felt a weight settle over the community that day, a kind of spiritual darkness that never lifted. Sarah Whitfield died at approximately 7:30 in the morning on January 16, 1887. She was 23 years old. She was 6 months pregnant, and she was killed not by the state, not by a legal authority, but by her own community, acting outside the law, driven by fear and shame, and a need to control something in a world that felt increasingly out of control. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Sarah's body was left hanging for 2 hours. This was not an oversight but a deliberate choice, made by Reverend Thorne and the other men who had organized the execution. They wanted the image of her hanging body to be seared into the memory of everyone present, especially the young women, as a warning. When she was finally cut down, her body was not returned to her family. Instead, it was taken by 3 men, Caleb Hutchins, Silas Carter, and Amos Pickett, to an unknown location in the woods and buried in an unmarked grave. No service was held. No marker was placed. For all official purposes, Sarah Whitfield simply ceased to exist. Her name was not mentioned in church. Her belongings were burned. Her family was forbidden from speaking about her. And the town of Crow's Mill moved on, or at least pretended to, as if nothing had happened. But you can't bury guilt as easily as you can bury a body. And within weeks, strange things began to occur in Crow's Mill, things that would haunt the town for decades. The first death came in early February. Silas Carter, one of the men who had buried Sarah's body, was found dead in his mill. The official cause of death was listed as an accident, a fall from the second floor onto the grinding stones below. But there were details that didn't fit the official story. Silas had operated that mill for 20 years and knew every inch of it. He was not the kind of man who would stumble or lose his footing. And when his body was examined, there were bruises on his neck that looked to some like the marks left by a rope. His death was ruled accidental, but people whispered. They remembered that Silas had been one of the men who buried Sarah. They remembered that he had seemed uneasy in the weeks after her execution, that he had stopped attending church, that he had been drinking more than usual. And they began to wonder if Sarah's death had not been the end of something but the beginning. In March, Reverend Josiah Thorne fell ill. It started with a cough, dry and persistent, that kept him awake at night. Then came fever, chills, sweating. Within 2 weeks he was bedridden. Within a month he was dead. The doctor who attended him, a traveling physician who stopped in Crow's Mill twice a year, listed the cause of death as consumption, but later admitted he wasn't certain. "I have seen consumption many times," he wrote in his journal, a document discovered by researchers in the 1980s. What killed Reverend Thorne looked like consumption, but it moved faster than any case I have seen before. And there was something else. In his final days, he became delirious, speaking to someone who was not there, calling out a name I did not recognize. When I asked his wife what name he was saying, she refused to tell me, but I heard it myself several times. He was saying Sarah. Thorne's death shook the community. He had been the moral leader of Crow's Mill, the man who had justified Sarah's execution with scripture and righteous conviction. And now he was dead, struck down in the prime of his life, raving about the woman he had helped to kill. People began to avoid talking about Sarah at all, as if saying her name would invite some kind of curse. But the deaths continued. By summer of 1887, 5 more people had died, 2 from illness, 1 from a farming accident, 1 from drowning despite being a strong swimmer, and 1, a woman named Martha Pickett, from suicide. Martha had been one of the most vocal supporters of Sarah's execution, writing letters to relatives in other towns describing the event in detail, justifying it as necessary and righteous. But in the months after Sarah's death, Martha became withdrawn. She stopped attending social gatherings. She stopped going to church. Her husband, Amos, later told a neighbor that Martha had begun seeing things, shadows moving in the corners of rooms, figures standing at the foot of the bed at night. She claimed she heard singing, a woman's voice, always the same hymn. And in June, Martha Pickett hanged herself in her own barn, using the same kind of rope that had been used to execute Sarah Whitfield. Her death was ruled a tragedy, the result of a disordered mind. But people couldn't help but notice the method she had chosen, and they couldn't help but remember that Martha had been there in the churchyard, watching as Sarah died. They couldn't help but wonder if Martha's suicide was an act of guilt or something else, something darker. The town of Crow's Mill began to fracture. Families who had lived side by side for generations stopped speaking to each other. Arguments broke out over trivial matters, often escalating to violence. The church, which had been the center of communal life, saw attendance drop dramatically. Some people left town entirely, moving to other communities, refusing to explain why. Those who stayed developed a kind of collective paranoia, a sense that they were being watched, judged, punished. And perhaps they were. Not by a ghost or a supernatural force, but by their own consciences, by the weight of what they had done. By the knowledge that they had participated in a murder and could never undo it. Guilt, it turns out, is a powerful haunting. It doesn't need chains or spectral apparitions. It just needs silence and time. Marcus Whitfield, Sarah's father, was one of the last to leave. He stayed in Crow's Mill for nearly a year after his daughter's execution, continuing to work as a blacksmith, attending church when he could force himself to go, avoiding eye contact with his neighbors. But by the end of 1887, something broke inside him. A neighbor later described finding Marcus in his workshop in the middle of the night, hammering a piece of iron over and over again, long after it had cooled, tears streaming down his face. Marcus sold his property in early 1888 and left Crow's Mill with his wife and remaining children. They moved west, to Ohio, and then to Illinois, changing their name to avoid association with what had happened. Marcus died in 1906, and according to his obituary, he was survived by his wife and 3 children. Sarah was not mentioned. It was as if she had never existed. But Marcus's youngest son, Jacob, who was 10 years old when Sarah was executed, later gave an interview to a historian in 1943, shortly before his own death. In that interview, Jacob spoke about his father with a mixture of pity and anger. "He never forgave himself," Jacob said. "He never spoke her name again after we left Kentucky, but I know he thought about her every day. I think he wanted to die. I think he spent the last 20 years of his life wishing he had died instead of her, and maybe he should have." If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? By the early 1900s, Crow's Mill was dying. The population had dropped from 300 to fewer than 100. The church was abandoned after a fire in 1902 destroyed the roof and part of the structure. The school closed when there were no longer enough children to justify keeping it open. The general store, the mill, the blacksmith shop, all of them shuttered. People left for the coal towns, for the cities, for anywhere that wasn't haunted by the memory of what had happened in that churchyard on a frozen morning in 1887. And those who stayed, those who couldn't or wouldn't leave, became insular and suspicious, refusing to talk about the past, teaching their children to avoid certain topics, passing down a legacy of silence that would last for generations. By 1935, Crow's Mill was a ghost town. The buildings had collapsed or been reclaimed by the forest. The roads had washed away. The cemetery, where many of the people who had participated in Sarah's execution were buried, was overgrown with weeds and briars. And Sarah Whitfield, whose death had set all of this in motion, remained in an unmarked grave somewhere in the woods, forgotten by everyone except a few descendants who carried the story like a secret shame. The story of Sarah Whitfield might have remained forgotten if not for the work of a historian named Elizabeth Calder. In 1976, Calder was researching the history of extrajudicial punishment in rural Appalachia when she came across a brief mention of Crow's Mill in a collection of oral histories housed at the University of Kentucky. The mention was vague, just a passing reference to a woman who was hanged by her neighbors for keeping company with a stranger. Intrigued, Calder began to investigate. She searched county records, court documents, newspaper archives, anything that might shed light on what had happened. What she found was almost nothing. No arrest record, no trial transcript, no death certificate. It was as if Sarah Whitfield had been erased from history, but Calder kept digging. She tracked down descendants of Crow's Mill families, traveling across Kentucky, Ohio, and Illinois, conducting interviews, collecting stories. Most people refused to talk. Some denied that the execution had ever happened. A few admitted that they had heard stories, but insisted that if the woman was hanged, she must have deserved it. Only one person was willing to tell the full story, a woman named Ruth Whitfield, Marcus Whitfield's great-granddaughter. And what Ruth told Elizabeth Calder changed everything. Ruth Whitfield was 83 years old when Calder interviewed her in 1978. She had never been to Crow's Mill, which was long abandoned by the time she was born, but she had grown up hearing stories from her grandfather, Jacob, Marcus Whitfield's youngest son. Jacob had been reluctant to talk about Sarah for most of his life, but in his final years, as his health declined and death approached, he began to open up. He told Ruth that Sarah had not been involved in a consensual relationship with Daniel Mercer. He told her that Daniel Mercer had assaulted Sarah, that the encounter had been violent and traumatic, and that Sarah had been too afraid to tell anyone what had happened. He told her that Marcus Whitfield had known, or at least suspected, the truth, but had chosen to remain silent because admitting that his daughter had been raped by an outsider would have been even more shameful than admitting she had willingly engaged in fornication. And he told her that the men who organized Sarah's execution, including Reverend Thorne, had also known, or strongly suspected, the truth, but had decided that killing Sarah was easier than confronting the reality of what had happened to her. They killed her to protect themselves. They killed her to avoid facing their own failure to protect a vulnerable woman. They killed her because it was easier to blame her than to blame a man who had already disappeared. And they killed her because they knew that as long as they all agreed on the story, no one would ever question it. This revelation recontextualizes everything about Sarah Whitfield's execution. If Jacob's account is accurate, and there is no reason to believe it isn't, then Sarah was not executed for fornication or adultery. She was executed for being a victim. She was executed because she was pregnant as a result of rape, and the community could not admit that such a thing had happened within their midst. So they transformed her from a victim into a villain, from someone who deserved sympathy into someone who deserved death. And in doing so, they ensured that the real crime, the real violence, would be buried forever. Or so they thought, because stories have a way of surviving, even when the people who lived them are gone. They survive in letters and oral histories and the memories of descendants. They survive in the silences and the gaps in the official record. They survive in the guilt that gets passed down from generation to generation, a kind of inherited trauma that shapes families and communities in ways they don't always understand. And they survive because people like Elizabeth Calder refuse to let them be forgotten. Calder published her findings in a book titled Forgotten Justice: Extrajudicial Executions in Appalachian America, released in 1982. The chapter on Sarah Whitfield was only 15 pages long, but it sparked a firestorm of debate among historians, legal scholars, and descendants of Appalachian communities. Some praised Calder for bringing attention to a forgotten injustice. Others accused her of sensationalizing a tragic but isolated incident. And a few, descendants of the families involved, accused her of defaming their ancestors, insisting that if the execution had happened at all, it must have been justified. The debate continues to this day, but what is not debatable is that Sarah Whitfield was killed by her community, that her death was witnessed by hundreds of people, and that no one was ever held accountable. Not legally, not morally, not in any way that mattered. The people who killed Sarah went on with their lives, raised families, died of old age, and were buried in marked graves with respectful obituaries. And Sarah was left in an unmarked grave in the woods, her name erased, her story silenced, her death treated as if it had never happened. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Sarah Whitfield's story is not what happened to her, but what it reveals about the communities we build and the choices we make when we are afraid. Crow's Mill was not an anomaly. It was not uniquely cruel or unusually barbaric. It was simply a community under pressure, isolated from external authority, struggling to maintain order in a world that felt chaotic and threatening. And when faced with a situation that challenged their moral framework, a situation that forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves, they chose the easiest path. They found a scapegoat. They blamed a victim. They turned violence into virtue and murder into justice. And they convinced themselves that they were doing the right thing. That is the real horror of this story. Not that a young woman was killed, but that the people who killed her believed they were righteous. That they stood in a churchyard, raised their hands to vote for her death, and then went home and slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they had done their duty. That is the horror that haunts us. Not ghosts, not curses, but the capacity for ordinary people to commit extraordinary cruelty and feel no guilt. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The ruins of Crow's Mill are still there, though there is almost nothing left to see. The site is on private land now, owned by a timber company that has no interest in preserving what remains. Most of the buildings have collapsed or been swallowed by the forest. The churchyard where Sarah was executed is overgrown with trees that are now over 100 years old, their roots pushing up through the ground, disturbing whatever might lie beneath. There is no marker to indicate what happened there. No plaque, no memorial. Just silence and the slow reclamation of the land by nature. But some people still visit. Descendants of the families involved, historians, curiosity seekers. They walk through the ruins, searching for something, though most of them couldn't say what. A sense of connection, perhaps. A way to understand. Or maybe just a way to bear witness, to acknowledge that something terrible happened here and that it should not be forgotten. In 2011, a group of historians and activists attempted to place a memorial marker at the site of Crow's Mill, honoring Sarah Whitfield and acknowledging the injustice of her death. The marker was simple, a flat stone with an inscription. In memory of Sarah Whitfield, 1864 to 1887, victim of communal violence, may her story not be forgotten. But before the marker could be installed, it was vandalized. Someone spray-painted over the inscription, rendering it unreadable. The marker was repaired and moved to a museum in Lexington, where it remains on display. The attempt to place it at Crow's Mill was abandoned. Some descendants of the families involved objected, claiming that the marker was an insult to their ancestors, an implication that their great-grandparents were murderers. Others simply wanted the past to stay buried. They didn't want to be reminded of what had happened. They didn't want to confront the guilt and shame that had been passed down through generations. And so Sarah Whitfield remains unmarked, unremembered, a ghost in every sense of the word. But the question that haunts this story, the question that Elizabeth Calder could never fully answer, is what happened to Daniel Mercer. If Sarah was indeed assaulted, if Daniel Mercer was responsible for her pregnancy, then where did he go? Did he simply leave town, unaware of what his actions had set in motion? Did he know that Sarah was pregnant and chose to abandon her, or did something else happen? There is a version of the story, passed down through oral tradition but never confirmed, that suggests Daniel Mercer did not leave Crow's Mill voluntarily. According to this version, Marcus Whitfield and several other men confronted Daniel in late August of 1886, shortly after Sarah revealed that she was pregnant. They accused him of assaulting Sarah. Daniel denied it. A fight broke out, and in the struggle, Daniel was killed. His body was taken into the woods and buried, and the men involved swore an oath never to speak of what had happened. This version of the story would explain why there is no record of Daniel Mercer after August of 1886. It would explain why the men of Crow's Mill were so eager to execute Sarah, because if they admitted that Daniel had assaulted her, they would also have to admit that they had killed him in retaliation, which would make them murderers. Killing Sarah allowed them to maintain the narrative that she was the guilty party, that she was the one who had brought shame on the community, and that Daniel Mercer was simply a man who had moved on. But this is speculation. There is no evidence to support it, no confession, no grave, nothing but whispers and the suspicion that there is more to this story than we will ever know. The last recorded mention of Crow's Mill in official documents comes from a census taken in 1930. The population was listed as 7. By 1940, the town was not included in the census at all. It had simply ceased to exist, erased from maps and records, forgotten by everyone except those who carried its stories. But the land remains. The mountains remain. The creek that gave the town its original name still flows through the valley, cold and clear, indifferent to the violence that occurred on its banks. And on certain nights when the wind moves through the trees, some people claim they can still hear it. Not a ghost, not a specter, but a voice singing a hymn, the words carried on the wind, a reminder that some things cannot be buried, no matter how deep you dig. Sarah Whitfield died on January 16, 1887, at the hands of her own community. She was 23 years old, she was 6 months pregnant, and she was killed not for what she did but for what she represented, a threat to the moral order, a reminder of vulnerability, a symbol of everything the community feared and could not control. They killed her to restore order. They killed her to send a message. They killed her because it was easier than confronting the truth. And in doing so, they destroyed themselves. Because a community that turns on its own, that sacrifices its most vulnerable members to protect its self-image, is not a community at all. It is a collection of individuals held together by fear and guilt, and it cannot survive. Crow's Mill did not survive. It died slowly, poisoned by the violence it had committed, haunted not by ghosts but by the weight of its own choices. And that, perhaps, is the real lesson of Sarah Whitfield's story. Not that bad things happen to good people, but that communities destroy themselves when they choose cruelty over compassion, when they choose silence over truth, when they choose to protect themselves at the expense of those who need protection most. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The legacy of Sarah Whitfield is complicated. She has become, in recent years, a symbol of the injustices that have been inflicted on women throughout history, particularly in isolated rural communities where male authority went unchallenged and women had no legal recourse. Her story has been told in academic papers, in books, in podcasts, in documentaries. She has been memorialized, mourned, remembered. But she has also been used, turned into a symbol that sometimes obscures the reality of who she was. We don't really know Sarah Whitfield. We don't know what she liked, what she feared, what she dreamed about. We don't know if she was happy before Daniel Mercer arrived, or if she was lonely, or if she was trapped in a life she didn't choose. We don't know what she thought about her pregnancy, whether she wanted the child or resented it. We don't know what she was thinking as she stood on the gallows, looking out at the crowd. All we know is that she lived and she suffered and she died. And that should be enough. It should be enough to remember her as a human being, not a symbol or a lesson or a cautionary tale, but a person who existed, who mattered, who deserved better than she got. In 2019, a descendant of Marcus Whitfield, a woman named Claire Patterson, published a memoir titled The Weight of Silence, in which she explored her family's connection to Sarah Whitfield and the execution that had haunted the Whitfield family for over a century. Claire had grown up knowing that there was something dark in her family's past, but she didn't learn the details until she was in her 30s, when her grandmother, on her deathbed, told her about Sarah. She said it was a story that should have been told a long time ago, Claire wrote. She said the family had been carrying the guilt for generations, passing it down like a curse, and that it was time to let it go. She said Sarah deserved to be remembered not as a sinner or a victim, but as a person, as someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who loved and was loved. And she said that if I ever had the chance, I should tell people what really happened. So that's what I'm doing. The memoir was controversial. Some praised it as a brave act of reckoning. Others criticized it as an exploitation of a tragic story. But Claire stood by her decision. "This is my family's history," she said in an interview, "and it's my responsibility to tell it honestly, even if it's painful, especially if it's painful." The question that remains, the question that no one has been able to answer, is whether there are other Sarah Whitfields, other women who were executed by their communities in similar circumstances, whose stories were never recorded, whose names were never remembered. Historians believe that Sarah's case was not unique, that extrajudicial executions were more common in isolated rural communities than official records suggest. But because these killings were never reported, never investigated, never prosecuted, they have left almost no trace. They exist only in oral histories and family secrets, in whispered stories and gaps in the historical record. And unless someone takes the time to search for them, to ask the uncomfortable questions, to dig through the archives and interview the descendants, they will remain forgotten. But perhaps that is changing. Perhaps slowly we are beginning to acknowledge these forgotten stories, to bring them into the light, to give voice to those who were silenced. It is slow work. It is painful work. It requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about our history, about our communities, about ourselves. But it is necessary work, because if we do not remember these stories, if we do not bear witness to these injustices, then we are complicit in the erasure. We become part of the silence. And the silence, as Sarah Whitfield learned, can be just as deadly as the rope. This is the story of Sarah Whitfield, a young woman who lived and loved and suffered in a community that ultimately destroyed her. A woman who was judged, condemned, and executed by people who believed they had the right to decide her fate. A woman whose name was erased, whose story was buried, whose death was treated as if it had never happened. But Sarah Whitfield was real. She existed. She mattered. And what was done to her was wrong. Not just morally wrong, but fundamentally, irredeemably wrong. And if we do not remember her, if we do not tell her story, if we do not acknowledge the violence that was done to her and the guilt that her killers carried to their graves, then we are no better than the people who stood in that churchyard and raised their hands to vote for her death. We become complicit. We become part of the machinery of silence and forgetting. And that, more than any ghost or curse, is the true horror of this story. Not what they did to Sarah Whitfield, but what we do when we choose to forget, when we choose to look away, when we choose silence over truth, comfort over justice, forgetfulness over remembrance. That is the horror that lives on, and it will continue to live on until we find the courage to face it. But there is one final question, one that haunts this story more than any other, one that Elizabeth Calder, despite years of research, could never answer, one that Ruth Whitfield, despite her grandfather's confessions, never fully understood, one that remains, even now, unresolved. If the men of Crow's Mill knew, or strongly suspected, that Sarah had been assaulted, if they understood that she was a victim and not a willing participant, then why did they kill her instead of seeking justice for her? Why did they turn their rage on a pregnant woman rather than on the man who had harmed her? The answer, according to some historians, lies in the fundamental structure of patriarchal communities, in the way women were seen not as individuals with rights and agency, but as property, as symbols of family honor, as vessels of community morality. When Sarah was assaulted, she became contaminated, damaged, unclean. And rather than confronting the violence that had been done to her, the men of Crow's Mill chose to erase her, to remove the evidence of their failure to protect her, to restore order by eliminating the reminder of disorder. But there is another possibility, one more disturbing, one that suggests a deeper, more intentional cruelty. Perhaps they killed Sarah because they could, because she was powerless and they were powerful, because she was alone and they were many. Because killing her was easier than admitting they had failed, easier than holding a man accountable, easier than changing the systems that had allowed the violence to happen in the first place. Perhaps they killed her because violence against women, when sanctioned by the community, when cloaked in the language of morality and justice, is easy. And perhaps they killed her because they knew they would never be held accountable. They knew there would be no investigation, no trial, no punishment. They knew they could do it and get away with it, and they were right, because they did. And that, more than anything else, is the question that haunts this story. Not what happened to Sarah Whitfield, but what it says about us, about the communities we build, about the violence we tolerate, about the silences we maintain, about the choices we make when we have power and others do not. That is the question Sarah Whitfield's story asks us to answer, and it is a question we have not yet answered.